They thought it would be a joke. A cruel invitation slipped into the hands of the woman who scrubbed their marble floors, polished their silverware, and carried their secrets in silence. A cleaning lady in Beverly Hills had never been meant to stand among the rich and powerful, at least not in their eyes. But what no one in that glittering ballroom realized was that by inviting her, they weren't setting up a moment of humiliation. They were lighting the fuse to their own destruction. When she appeared, she didn't come in rags or borrowed clothes. She arrived like royalty, every step echoing with a confidence that froze the room. And in that instant, the whispers turned to shock, because hidden beneath her quiet uniform had always been a truth more dangerous than wealth, a connection that could rip apart one of California's most powerful families. This wasn't just another gala. It would become the night Beverly Hills discovered that the woman they mocked for years carried with her not shame, but power. The kind of power that would expose betrayal, racism, and a crime buried for decades. And when the truth finally emerged, the empire of arrogance built to crush her would collapse before everyone's eyes. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover powerful tales of dignity, resilience, and justice in the face of racism. The Blackwood Mansion stood like a monument to excess in the hills of Beverly Hills. Gleaming marble floors, chandeliers dripping with crystals, and halls echoing with the kind of laughter that only came from people who had never known hunger. For years, Victoria had moved silently through these rooms, dusting, scrubbing, polishing, always present, yet treated as invisible. She was the Blackwoods' cleaning lady, and in their eyes, nothing more. The wealthy guests often passed her without acknowledgement, as if she were another piece of furniture. But sometimes they did notice her, just enough to deliver a cruel smile or a dismissive remark. To them, she wasn't just poor, she was black, and that was all they needed to decide she didn't belong in their world. So when Richard Blackwood, heir to the fortune and master of arrogance, handed her a golden invitation to the family's upcoming charity gala, it wasn't kindness. It was cruelty dressed in gold. The words, maximum elegance, had been emphasized with a sneer. His friends chuckled behind their glasses of imported wine, whispering about how funny it would be to see the cleaning lady show up, stumbling in borrowed clothes and leaving humiliated. For them, it was entertainment. For Victoria, it was a choice. She could stay home, avoid the trap, and let their laughter win. Or she could walk into that ballroom and face every mocking glance head-on. The irony was bitter. She had spent 2 years cleaning that very ballroom, vacuuming the plush carpets, polishing the banisters, wiping fingerprints off champagne glasses she would never be invited to drink from. She had memorized the space like a stage, but one she was never meant to step onto as a player. And yet, when she opened the envelope, she didn't see humiliation. She saw an opportunity. Because unlike the Blackwoods, Victoria knew something they had long forgotten. She had once belonged to that world. Her past wasn't just one of poverty and servitude. Her roots ran through the same halls the Blackwoods claimed as their kingdom. But for now, no one knew that. The days leading up to the gala buzzed with malicious excitement. The household staff whispered about the cruel bet Richard had made with his wife, that Victoria would either never show up, or if she did, she'd crumble under the weight of embarrassment within minutes. The guests were already preparing their sarcastic captions for social media, ready to laugh at the black cleaning lady who dared to imagine herself among them. Victoria heard every word. She kept her head down, her hands busy, but her mind was sharp and her resolve even sharper. She knew they were underestimating her. They always had. On the night of the gala, the mansion glittered brighter than ever. Luxury cars lined the driveway, photographers swarmed the entrance, and gowns worth fortunes floated through the doors. Every guest sparkled, every smile rehearsed. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, champagne, and arrogance. And then, silence. Because down the marble staircase came Victoria. No uniform, No borrowed dress, but a gown so elegant it looked as though it had stepped out of history. Her posture was perfect, her expression calm, and her presence undeniable. For the first time, the wealthy elite who had mocked her stopped laughing. Not out of respect, but out of confusion. How could she look like that? Where had she gotten a dress like that? The truth, of course, was far more dangerous than any of them imagined. But Victoria said nothing. Not yet. She didn't need to. Her very presence had already disrupted the script Richard Blackwood had written for her humiliation. She wasn't just stepping into their world. She was reclaiming something they had tried to erase. And as the night unfolded, that cruel invitation would become the stage for the downfall of an empire. From the moment Victoria stepped into the ballroom, eyes followed her like spotlights. Some were wide with disbelief, others narrowed with disdain. The laughter came slowly at first. Nervous, hushed whispers exchanged between sequined shoulders. But as more guests realized who she was, the ridicule spread like wildfire. "Isn't that the maid?" someone hissed near the champagne tower. Another guest smirked and added, "Richard wasn't joking after all." Phones slipped discreetly from purses and jackets. Photos were snapped, ready to be captioned with mocking words. For the wealthy crowd, this wasn't a woman in a gown. It was tonight's entertainment. Richard Blackwood, glowing with smug satisfaction, raised his glass and gave Victoria a look of false pity. He had orchestrated the humiliation perfectly. In his mind, she was already defeated. But Victoria didn't falter. She moved through the ballroom with the elegance of someone who belonged, not hurried, not ashamed. Each step was deliberate, her head high, her silence sharper than any words could have been. And the more confident she appeared, the more unsettled the guests became. Racism, however, doesn't surrender easily. It adapts, twisting itself into sly comments and sharpened smiles. At the buffet, one woman looked her up and down and remarked loudly, "Well, someone's been playing dress-up." Another chuckled, "Careful, she might think the caviar is chocolate pudding." The cruelty was always coated in laughter, disguised as harmless jokes, but every syllable dripped with venom. Victoria's face betrayed nothing, yet inside, every word added fuel to a fire she had carried for years. They thought her silence was weakness. They mistook her composure for submission. What they didn't realize was that she was waiting for the perfect moment, and that moment was drawing closer. Richard's friends had taken the humiliation further. They circled near the dance floor, loudly debating how long she would last. 10 minutes before she flees," one guessed. "No, she'll make it an hour. She's desperate for attention," another sneered. Their wives giggled, pretending not to be part of the cruelty while clinging tighter to their diamonds. Still, Victoria stood tall. She greeted servers she once worked beside, thanked them as though they were equals, because they were. To the staff, her transformation wasn't a joke. It was vindication. They watched her with hidden smiles, rooting for her in ways the wealthy would never understand. The Blackwoods, however, grew restless. The plan was unraveling. Richard had expected her to blush, to stammer, to run. Instead, she glided with the poise of someone untouchable. Each passing minute turned the mockery back onto them. If she wasn't embarrassed, then who was the fool? And then came the first fracture. An older guest, Mr. Hargrove, peered at Victoria for a long time. His glass trembled slightly as he whispered to his wife, "She looks familiar." His voice carried just enough to ripple through the circle of guests. Others leaned in, curious. Familiar? How could the cleaning lady look familiar to one of Beverly Hills' most elite families? Richard brushed it off with a laugh, quickly changing the subject. But the seed had been planted. The whispers shifted. Mockery mixed with suspicion. Victoria noticed, of course. She noticed everything. The way Richard's jaw tightened. The way his wife, Eleanor, avoided looking directly at her. The way the laughter felt less certain now, the way silence began stretching longer between the cruel jokes. Because beneath all their arrogance, fear had started to creep in. The truth was beginning to claw its way to the surface, and when it did, the entire Blackwood Empire would tremble. By midnight, the gala was reaching its peak. Music swelled, the dance floor spun with gowns and tuxedos, and speeches about charity echoed with empty sincerity. But the tension surrounding Victoria never eased. Everywhere she went, whispers followed, some mocking, some suspicious, and in the corner, Richard Blackwood's smile was fading. His carefully laid plan of humiliation was slipping beyond his control. The woman he had invited as a cruel joke was becoming the center of the evening, but not as a victim, as something far more dangerous. Victoria had been underestimated her entire life. Tonight she would show them why that was a mistake. The rising tide of whispers, the unease etched across Richard's face, and the growing realization that their cruel entertainment was unraveling. It all built to the moment none of them could escape. The gala was no longer their stage. It was hers. The moment arrived not with thunder, but with silence. The orchestra paused between songs, the chatter lulled, and for the briefest heartbeat, the gala stood still. In that breathless quiet, Victoria stepped onto the marble stage near the grand staircase, a place where, until now, only the Blackwoods themselves had spoken. Eyes snapped to her. Some widened in disbelief, others narrowed in disgust. Richard chuckled, lifting his glass, certain she was about to embarrass herself beyond repair. "Here it comes," he whispered to a friend. But what came was not shame. It was revelation. Victoria began with a voice calm and steady, carrying through the ballroom without effort. She didn't shout, she didn't plead. She simply spoke. She spoke of service, of scrubbing floors and polishing silver for people who never bothered to learn her name. She spoke of invisibility, of being treated as though she was less than human. And then, with a pause sharp enough to cut glass, she revealed what none of them expected. Her name wasn't just Victoria, the maid. Her full name was Victoria Blackwood. A stunned gasp tore through the crowd. Richard froze. Eleanor dropped her wineglass, crimson liquid spilling like blood across the floor. Victoria continued, her voice unwavering. She told them of her father, a wealthy businessman who had once loved a woman society called unworthy because of the color of her skin. That woman had been Victoria's mother. When the affair was discovered, the family buried the truth, cast out the child, and pretended she had never existed. But blood doesn't disappear so easily. The Blackwood fortune, the mansion, the glittering chandeliers, all of it had been built on the same foundation that carried through Victoria's veins. She wasn't just a servant in their home. She was part of the family they had tried to erase. Whispers erupted into chaos. Some guests covered their mouths in shock. Others leaned forward, hungry for scandal. The staff stood taller, pride swelling in their chests. For once, the balance of power had shifted, and the people who once mocked her were the ones trembling. Richard tried to laugh it off. He raised his glass again, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's delusional," he spat. "A liar desperate for attention." But Victoria had come prepared. From her clutch, she produced a faded letter sealed with the Blackwood crest. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she unfolded it, her father's words, written in ink decades earlier, acknowledging her as his daughter. His signature gleamed at the bottom like a dagger aimed at Richard's pride. The ballroom erupted. Guests murmured, phones lit up, cameras clicked. The humiliation Richard had so carefully crafted had inverted, devouring him instead. Eleanor shrieked at her husband, demanding explanations. His friends backed away, suddenly unwilling to be associated with the scandal unraveling before them. The same mouths that once mocked Victoria now whispered her name with awe, fear, or opportunistic respect. And still, she stood calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't scream. She simply let the truth hang in the air, undeniable and unshakable. Richard lunged forward, fury boiling over. "You don't belong here!" he roared, his voice breaking the last pretense of civility. But Victoria didn't flinch. She turned, eyes locking on his, and delivered the words that shattered him completely. "I belong here more than you ever did. This house was built with my bloodline, not your arrogance." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in his life, Richard Blackwood had no reply. The orchestra, uncertain but sensing the moment, struck a tentative note. The guests shifted, torn between leaving and staying to witness history. And in that charged silence, the truth cemented itself. The cleaning lady they mocked was not their entertainment. She was their equal, or worse for them, their judge. The gala, intended to be a display of wealth and superiority, had transformed into a courtroom. And the verdict was clear. Richard Blackwood had orchestrated a cruel joke. But in the end, the joke was on him. The ballroom was no longer filled with laughter or music. It was heavy with shock, embarrassment, and the suffocating weight of truth. Richard Blackwood, once untouchable in his own home, stood pale and trembling, his empire crumbling in front of the very people he had invited to witness a spectacle of cruelty. Victoria, however, did not linger in his downfall. She did not need to. His destruction had already begun the moment she revealed her name. Instead, she lifted her chin, allowed the silence to stretch, and then stepped gracefully down from the staircase. Each footstep echoed like a drumbeat of victory, steady and undeniable. The staff, the same men and women who had endured years of condescension, straightened as she passed. They looked at her not as a co-worker, but as a symbol, proof that no amount of power or wealth could erase the truth. For them, her triumph was theirs too. The guests scattered into uneasy clusters. Some whispered furiously, hungry to carry the scandal beyond those marble walls. Others offered forced smiles, trying to align themselves with Victoria now that the tide had turned. Opportunism dripped from their every gesture, but it didn't matter. Their whispers, their schemes, their shallow apologies, none of it could change what had already happened. Eleanor Blackwood, once the queen of the house, sat slumped in her chair, mascara running, her hand shaking as she clutched a glass of champagne. Everything she had built, her reputation, her status, now hung by a thread, and the man who had promised her a life of superiority was exposed as a coward. Richard himself tried to recover. He raised his voice, calling Victoria a liar, a fraud, a woman grasping at shadows. But his words were hollow. The letter she held, his father's letter, had already condemned him. Guests who once cheered his arrogance now turned their backs. Business partners whispered about pulling out of deals. Donors slipped out of the gala without a word. His carefully polished empire was crumbling, not with a bang, but with a quiet, humiliating unraveling. Victoria didn't need to say more. Her silence spoke louder than his rage ever could. And yet, even in that silence, her message was clear. Dignity cannot be erased, no matter how hard the world tries to bury it. By the time the clock struck midnight, Victoria had left the mansion. She didn't storm out in anger or linger in triumph. She simply walked away, her gown shimmering under the glow of the chandeliers, leaving behind the ruins of an empire that had underestimated her. Outside, the night air was cool, crisp, and alive with freedom. For the first time in years, Victoria felt light, not because her past had been erased, but because she had reclaimed it. The scars of being invisible, of being mocked, of being treated as less than human were still there. But now, those scars told a different story. They were proof of survival, proof of strength. In the weeks that followed, the Blackwood scandal spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of betrayal, hidden heirs, and the collapse of Beverly Hills' most arrogant family. Richard lost contracts, Eleanor lost friends, and the family's name became a stain rather than a crown. Victoria, however, gained something far greater than wealth. She gained visibility. People began to see her not as a servant, not as an object of pity, but as a woman who had stood against cruelty and reclaimed her voice. She didn't chase revenge. She didn't seek fortune. She chose something far more powerful: dignity. For those who had watched her be mocked, her story became a beacon. To the staff who had been silenced, she was proof that injustice could be overturned. To those who lived daily with the weight of racism, she was a reminder that no amount of arrogance or cruelty could erase the truth of who they were. The Blackwoods had tried to use her as a joke, but in the end, the joke revealed their own corruption. And so, the question remained, hanging in the air long after the scandal faded from the headlines: how many more Victorias are out there? How many more voices have been silenced, dismissed, or mocked, waiting for the right moment to rise, to reclaim what was always theirs? Because the truth is, racism doesn't always wear a mask of violence. Sometimes it hides behind laughter, behind smug invitations, behind jokes that cut deeper than knives. But every joke leaves a scar, and every scar carries a story waiting to be told. Victoria's story was one of reclamation. She did not need the Blackwoods' approval. She did not need their wealth. She needed only the truth and the courage to stand in it. And so, when the lights of the Blackwood mansion finally dimmed and the echoes of that fateful gala faded into silence, the world remembered not the cruelty of the joke, but the power of the woman who rose above it, the woman they tried to laugh at, the woman they tried to erase, the woman who walked in as a servant and left as a queen. Takeaway, call to action for viewers. Her story is a reminder: dignity cannot be stolen, truth cannot be buried, and no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, has the right to decide who belongs. So ask yourself, when the world laughs at someone for simply existing, will you join the laughter? Or will you listen to the story beneath the scars? If you believe stories like Victoria's deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, because every story matters.